Thank you all for coming out. This has been the first press conference in a couple of weeks, maybe even more than a month. And I know the press has been very anxious for us to have a press conference, and for a number of reasons from time to time, we have been unable to do so. But certainly it is not for lack of trying, and also in terms of a number of issues that would have superseded us having a press conference on the prescribed date, that is Tuesday afternoons at 2 o'clock, until some change is made for one reason or another. Today is the day when the Order in Council comes into being by proclamation by the governor signed on the 7th of May. And copies of that proclamation may have been already circulated, but I have a couple of copies here for members of the press who have not received their copies, and I also will have the secretary send out copies of the proclamation as well as copies of the Order in Council to members of the press and media houses a little later. I'm going to ask the Minister of Home Affairs and Legal and Constitutional Affairs to make a presentation on the impacts of the Order in Council in a summary form, so that persons can have a clear idea of what has been agreed, because reading the proclamation may be a little complicated for a meeting like this. So it will be better if she presents a précis of those changes that have been made. And I think the Minister of Home Affairs, as you know, Mrs. Cora Richardson Hodge, has been very actively involved in this process from upon coming to office, to make sure that constitutional reform takes place, to make sure that labor reform takes place, as well as ensuring that electoral reform takes place. And this Order in Council is an aspect of that process to enable us to make certain consequential changes to the Constitution ahead of the entire constitutional review, so that we can allow enough time for election with some of the critical changes that will be made, especially as it relates to the expansion of the House of Assembly, other changes in terms of eligibility for elections, in terms of children and grandchildren and so forth, but I'm not going to bring that up. It's also important for me also to respond to a number of issues that have been raised over the past month or so, or maybe even before that. Because from time to time, issues become a trend in the local news and social media that people make a big fuss about, even when they're not fully apprised of all the issues involved. And one of those issues that was raised a couple of weeks ago was the Foreign Affairs Committee report, which made a number of recommendations to the FCO as a part of their remit. And a number of persons within the community flew about with those recommendations as if they were, in fact, agreed measures or agreed proposals by the government of the United Kingdom. Those recommendations are exactly what they are, representations that were made to the Foreign Combat Office responsible for the overseas territories. And it had to do with the management and governance of overseas territories, as well as other concerns that members of the Foreign Affairs Committee would have had regarding the way the Foreign Combat Office is managing the affairs of overseas territories and managing areas of interest in which they had interest. Those issues were raised, and as I said on a number of programs, these are simply proposals and recommendations or findings of that committee, and the FCO, or the government through the FCO, would respond to those recommendations. And I received a correspondence from Lord Ahmed, dated the 9th of May, which would have been last Thursday. It was embargoed until Monday, I think. Those responses from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the government, to the issues raised by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Let me read the letter from Lord Ahmed to me in this connection. Dear Victor, I'm pleased to be able to share with you the Foreign and Commonwealth Office formal response to the Foreign Affairs Committee inquiry into the future of the overseas territories. The Foreign Affairs Committee greatly valued your engagement and that of other territories. I'm particularly appreciated in the fact that the contributions highlighted a range of issues for future consideration. The FCO will be hosting an interministerial meeting later in the year to look at the long-term strategy for the overseas territories, as well as discuss many of the issues raised by the committee's report. I will provide a further update to you following this meeting. The Joint Ministerial Council on the 25th to the 27th of November will be an opportunity for further discussion. I look forward to the UK Overseas Territories International Trade Summit in the Cayman Islands next month and hope to see you there. Yours sincerely, Tariq. Now, I'm not going to go through all aspects of that response, but there were a number of questions that were raised by members of this community, because you would have gotten the impression that the Foreign Affairs Committee report only responded to 3 or 4 issues, but they responded to a number of issues, 9 of which the government, being the government of UK through the FCO, made responses to the Foreign Affairs Committee. I will raise the questions, some of the comments that were made and the responses that I think were made by the UK government through the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to those questions raised. The first response was to the comment regarding an independent review of the cross-government engagement with the overseas territories and the FPO's management of its responsibilities towards them. And the Foreign Affairs Committee was recommended that, drawing on international comparisons, this review should consider alternatives to the FCO and assess the costs and benefits and risks associated with moving primary responsibility from the overseas territories away from the FCO. The findings of the review should be presented to the House and shared with the elected overseas territories government as soon as feasible. This comment came as a result of some of the representations which members of the overseas territories made when we gave evidence at the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we were saying that there needs to be some changes in the way the overseas territories and the FCO engage on issues related to them. The FCO made a response to that, and I'll read the last part of that response, which clearly outlines what they propose. Accordingly, they say the FCO is open to ideas of how this structure could evolve to support the modern 21st century relationships to which both the overseas territories and UK governments aspire. The Foreign Secretary has committed to considering this and other longer-term issues, including the possibility of an independent review through an interministerial group that will meet in the summer. So they are prepared to respond to that comment by saying those recommendations, by saying that they will have a committee to look at them during the forthcoming months. The other question was raised was the FCO must ensure that officials it appoints in the overseas territories have the skills necessary both to build constructive relationships with the overseas territory governments and to ensure that the territories' governments meets the highest standards. In its response to this report, the FCO should explain the process it has put in place for advertising and recruiting for positions in the overseas territories, such as governorships, and what it does to consult the overseas governments on these appointments. The FCO should also outline the training it provides to the officials it appoints to the overseas territories, both in advance of and during their postings, and how it assesses their performance. This came as a result of the fact that a number of overseas territories, in giving evidence, stated that they felt that governors came to this part of the world, to the overseas territories, they were not carefully vetted, they were not always suited to the task that they took up, and they were not necessarily trained to deal with situations in the overseas territories. As a result, their performance was below par. These are questions that we raised, and the Foreign Affairs Committee took it on board and made a recommendation that the FCO should ensure that its officials appointed meet the necessary skill sets relative to building those relationships. The FCO response was that the FCO requires officers to complete pre-posting training before taking up a role in overseas territories. A governor designate will have a program designed specifically for them and the territory they are designated for. This will also include attending the FCO Head of Mission course, the Crisis Leadership course in order to prepare for natural disasters such as hurricanes, completing the finance and security training and wide range of calls and visits to relevant stakeholders. If logistics do not allow an officer to complete all the courses before the postings begin, they will do so as soon as possible after that. Other officers undertaking roles in the overseas territories, such as heads of governors' offices, will also complete similar pre-posting training. Once officers have taken up their position, their performance is managed through the FCO performance management system using objective setting appraisals and 360 feedback. Their performance is appraised and moderated in the normal way across the board. So in other words, they recognize the fact that in some cases there are situations where postings represent a misfit between the officer appointed and the position they need to take up in the overseas territories, and they are doing something about that, and they actually have a program in place that allows for that, but it needs to be looked at in a much more comprehensive way. The other question that was raised among stakeholders in the financial services industry was the question raised on beneficial ownership and registers of beneficial ownership. The Foreign Secretary, in cooperation with the elected governments of the OTs, and this is the recommendation from the FAC, Foreign Affairs Committee, should lay out before the summer recess a clear and detailed timetable for the publication of registers of beneficial ownership in each overseas territory. The response from the government is that the FCO is not currently in a position to lay out detailed timetables for each territory, and the timetable for implementing registers in each overseas territory will differ depending on its fiscal position and business model. However, we will do so when this becomes clear. And also they mentioned that the government will prepare an order in council by the end of December, with the territories expected to have functional, publicly accessible registers as soon as possible, and no later than the end of 2023, because the Foreign Affairs Committee had recommended that the order in council be implemented as early as the end of this year. Yeah. And we are scoping the assistance the OTs will require, the overseas territories will require, and will be holding technical workshops and providing OTs with assistance during the coming months. This will support the overseas territories in developing publicly accessible registers. So that was one of the issues raised by the industry. And one of the top trending issues that was raised within the community was the other recommendation coming from the FAC, number 8. The government should set a date by which it expects all overseas territories to have legalized same-sex marriage. If that deadline is not met, the government should intervene through legislation or an order in council. That is what the Foreign Affairs Committee recommended. That was the subject of much discussion throughout Anguilla, and the response coming from the UK government and the Foreign Incumbent Office on that issue is as follows. The UK government is committed to equal rights, including LGBT rights. We believe that the strongest, safest, and most prosperous societies are those in which all citizens can live freely without fear of discrimination, and where all citizens, including LGBT people, can play a full and active part in society. 9 overseas territories have legal recognition and protection for same-sex relationships. At the time of writing, a 10th territory, the Cayman Islands, was granted a stay in the Chief Justice's ruling in favor of same-sex marriage until August 2019, when the government's appeal will be heard. The British overseas territories are separate, largely self-governing jurisdictions with their own democratically elected representatives. Our relationship with the overseas territories is based on partnership, and therefore, as policy on marriage law is an area of devolved responsibility, it should be for the territories themselves to decide and legislate on. As has been demonstrated by recent LGBT cases, the territories' justice mechanisms and processes should be allowed the space to address these issues and these matters. We are working to encourage those territories that have not put in place arrangements to recognize and protect same-sex relationships to do so, and continue to engage with all the overseas territories to ensure that their legislation is compliant with their international human rights obligations. LGBT rights and broader human rights obligations are consistently raised by the leaders of overseas territories, both bilaterally and at the Overseas Territories Joint Ministerial Council. This is also a matter that is raised by Governor's Office. We have no plans to introduce an order in council on this issue. I repeat, we have no plans to introduce an order in council on this issue. And then there's the final big issue that has been raised. The UK government came from the FAC. The UK government should initiate a consultation with the elected governments of the overseas territories and work with them to agree a plan to ensure that there is a pathway for all resident UK and British overseas territory citizens to be able to vote and hold elected office in territory. In its response to this report, the FCO should lay out a timetable for this consultation process and set a deadline for phasing out discriminatory elements of belongership or its territory-specific equivalents. This is what the FAC recommended. The British government, in its response to the document that I'm now reading, states as follows. The UK government understands the committee's concerns and continues to impress upon overseas territories governments the importance of allowing people who have made their permanent home in the territories the ability to vote and exchange fully in the community. But the UK government recognizes the desire of island communities to maintain their cohesion, hence the need for a reasonable qualifying process. We understand the overseas territories' concerns, sensitivities, and historical background on this issue. Our vision for the overseas territories is as vibrant and flourishing communities with the widest possible opportunities for their people. We expect territory governments to meet the same high standards as the UK government in maintaining the rule of law, respect for human rights, and integrity in public life, delivering efficient public services, and building strong and successful communities. In the spirit of a relationship based on partnership, we will continue to support and encourage consistent and open political engagement on belongership and its territory-specific equivalents, whilst respecting the fact that immigration decisions are primarily a matter for overseas territories governments. The FCO does not plan at a future date to publish such a timetable for what has been suggested by the Foreign Affairs Committee. So I thought it was important to respond to a number of those issues that were raised during the dialogue on the report from the Foreign Affairs Committee. And the fact that the Foreign Affairs Committee's report are just recommendations. A number of the recommendations that are included in that report came on the basis of consultations and the select committee evidence gathering exercise that took place with all elected, with all chief ministers and premiers of the overseas territories in London. We were a part of that, and I presented our views for the relationship at that meeting. And a number of the issues raised here came as a result of those consultations. But also the Foreign Affairs Committee are made of persons who have their own agendas and their own personal interests that they want to advance. And as a result, a number of these issues that the Anguillan public had a response to would have been included in those response, but they were not British policy. They were not decisions made in the House of Commons or the House of Lords or among the British government officials. They were recommendations, and they remain recommendations. And we now have the British response to some of those critical issues that were raised in Anguilla. So with those short comments, I would like to turn over to the Minister of Home Affairs to speak to the issue of the proclamation of the order in council, which has become effective today, and the implications for that for the time being for overseas territory, for Anguilla.